Hello, and welcome to the From the Shadows podcast. I am the producer, Jason Lewis. I would like to thank you for tuning in to the From the Shadows podcast. And without further ado, here is your host, Shane Grove.
Welcome, everybody. This is Shane Grove, the host of From the Shadows podcast, and I'm here with Jason, the producer.
Hey, how's it going, everybody?
Hey, Jason. I think you are in agreement with me that this episode that we are introducing here is probably one of our favorites so far, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah, I would. This is the first collaboration we've done like this, and we couldn't have done it with a better person than Kate.
Yeah, Kate. So to give a little backstory, we've become friends with Kate, the host of the award-winning podcast, Ignorance Was Bliss. And so we kind of did a cool little cross-promotion / hybrid episode with her where we took our very North Central Ohio's very own Mark Corey. He's a local historian, former English teacher at a local high school, and basically an expert on the Salem witch trials and Colonel William Crawford, which to our North Central Ohio listeners, Colonel Crawford will have a familiar ring to it. It's the school that Mark actually taught at, and Colonel Crawford himself was a very important figure in the early stages of the United States of America, as far as our country being founded, and then suffered a cruel twist of fate, you might say, when he came out of retirement. So what we want to do is that Kate is based out of Salem, Massachusetts, where, of course, it was the genesis for the Salem witch trials. So we recorded what basically is a double episode. But to hear the episode of the Salem witch trials, when you're done listening to our episode, which features Mr. Corey speaking about Colonel William Crawford, you can go into the show description, and there will be a link to Kate's podcast, which is going to be released the same day today. That will take you, then you can listen to Mr. Corey on her podcast talk about the Salem witch trials. Jason, you got something you want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, actually, you covered what I was going to say. But I did want to mention about Colonel William Crawford. That's also the same Colonel William Crawford that Crawford County, the city of Bucyrus, was named after. I mean, we're talking a major figure here. We're talking about somebody who is just as important in history as George Washington himself.
Yeah, because here's the thing about Colonel Crawford is the people that listen to this podcast that are from our area, that know us, they're going to understand one aspect of Colonel Crawford's life as far as being integral for the county being named after him, the local high school, the monuments that are placed around the county, marking a couple infamous spots for his life. But then on a grander scale, the people that are listening to our podcast from basically all over the world, they're going to really recognize some of the other things that Colonel Crawford did or was a part of when it comes down to history. So it was a real eye opener for us, and I will say the most amazing thing when we walked out of these. We were in there for at least an hour and a half, almost 2 hours, listening to Mr. Corey, and the man did not have a single note. Nothing was written down. So as you listen to our podcast and Kate's podcast, every single date, name, place, little anecdote, straight off Mr. Corey's head. So I left. I left that day that we recorded these podcasts thinking Mark Corey is the bomb when it comes to history. there's no two ways about it. So
oh yeah, he knows his material. That's for
he
sure.
knows his stuff. I was impressed.
He is quite a historian.
Yes, and anybody that gets the chance, I think, to, especially in our area, to maybe take 5 minutes and talk to him, I would urge you, because I don't think there's probably anything that the man does not know when it pertains to history, especially in our area. So, and I do think that the people are going to be fascinated by the discussion about the Salem witch trials that takes place on Kate's podcast, and mainly because Mr. Corey, his relative, Giles Corey, was the last person put to death in the Salem witch trial hysteria. So yeah, please, when you're done listening to our podcast about Colonel William Crawford, go check out Kate's podcast, Ignorance Was Bliss, and get the rest of what Mr. Corey has to say about American history.
You will not be disappointed. You will be entertained, and you will be enlightened.
Well, maybe scared to death, more so than enlightened. But either way, it's fun. It's a fun thing to have happen. So check out our episode, and then go find Kate's episode with Mr. Corey on Ignorance is Bliss. And if you can't find it, Jason's going to put a link in the show description, and you should take you right there to it. So we're looking forward to hearing what everybody has to say about these two podcasts, because it sure was fun. And thanks to Kate for joining us, because Kate is super entertaining, super smart, and is it's one of the perks of doing this is we get to meet some really cool people.
She was a blast. She was a blast.
Yep. So we won't take up any more of your time. We'll get you to the episode.
Got one more thing to say, though. I think that you will be enlightened on this. I think you're going to enjoy it, and you're going to learn something about where you're at. If you're local here in the northeastern Ohio or western Ohio or central Ohio where we're at, you're going to learn something. You're going to enjoy it. So tune in, sit back and enjoy, and make sure you pop over to Kate's podcast. Like your host Shane said, there will be a link in the description below. So just enjoy them, and afterwards head to After the Shadows and discuss it a little bit. Or if you got any questions or anything like that, it's a perfect place to bring it up. We respond. We look forward to hearing from you.
Yes, we do. So with that, on with the podcast.
Alrighty, let's go.
This is Shane Grove, host of From the Shadows podcast, and joining us this morning are some members of the crew. The judge.
Good morning.
Jason, the producer.
Yes, sir.
Jerry, our lead investigator and photographer today.
Hey there, everyone.
We're joined in studio by local historian Mark Corey.
Good morning.
And we have a very special guest on the line from the award-winning podcast, Ignorance Was Bliss, Kate. Kate, how are you doing this morning?
I'm well, thank you. How are you guys?
Good.
Okay.
Good. We're glad you could join us. We're going to, for your listeners that are going to come to check you out on our podcast, and our listeners that we're going to send to your podcast, we've already spent a good while talking about the Salem witch hysteria from the 1600s, and now we're going to talk about a little history from our corner of the world in north central Ohio, and that's why we have our expert historian here, Mark Corey, about one Mr. Colonel Crawford. So, Mark, would you give a little history on who Colonel Crawford was and what his accomplishments and then we'll lead to his demise and just go on with the story.
Colonel William Crawford was born in Virginia in 1732. Was born right down the road from where George Washington was born, and they became close friends in childhood. And when they hit early adolescence, they both surveyed and speculated land for the Virginia Land Company prior to the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, which textbooks call the French and Indian War. And once that war broke out, Washington became the commander of the 9th Virginia Militia, and Captain William Crawford was the second in command of that same militia. They served on the campaign of Braddock when he attempted to destroy the French fort of Duquesne, when a small group of French trappers and Native Americans ambushed this large British column of nearly 1,200 troops and nearly wiped them out. And it would not have been for the Virginia militia being there, no one would have survived the ambush. It was during this retreat that Colonel Washington promoted Captain Crawford to the rank of colonel because of bravery that he exhibited under fire. And most of the British officers were killed during the ambush, and most of the Virginia militia survived the ambush, primarily because militia, being familiar with Indian style of warfare, were able to survive fighting Native Americans using Native American tactics, while the European tradition was to march in the open field in beautiful red coats and were not allowed to fire unless being given orders to fire once they formed into ranks out in the middle of the woods to be easily picked off by the Native Americans.
So essentially they did not have any skirmishers.
Right.
And it was right then and there that Washington and Crawford knew we could win the revolution.
Well, they actually learned quite a bit, as did a lot of colonials, from what they saw the British unsuccessful in attempting to do.
So was Braddock also killed during that?
Yeah, Braddock was one of the first, and he died during the retreat. And
run away, he died.
Yeah.
Wow.
One of the drivers of the wagons in that expeditionary force of Braddock was Daniel Boone. The supply wagons that included 10 cannons were part of a 10-mile-long wagon train with everything, the wagons and the cannons, in the back of the command. And interesting, Braddock actually got a loan from Dr. Ben Franklin in Philadelphia to be able to purchase those wagons to be used in the expedition. And obviously, since all those wagons were left behind, Franklin's out the money. But post 7 Years' War, Washington and Crawford go back to serving as speculators for the Virginia Land Company. They speculated land as far north of Columbus, Ohio area. And at the outbreak of the War of Independence, Washington promoted himself to get the head job, which he successfully gained as commander of the Continental Army. And Crawford still remained in the 9th Virginia at the rank of colonel. Crawford and Washington served together by crossing the Delaware River on Christmas Day night in 1776 en route to our victory against the German Jaegers or Hessians at Trenton, New Jersey. Crawford served with Washington at the Valley Forge encampment of 1777 and 78. And in 1779, Crawford retired from military duty. He retired to his home and his farm along the Youghiogheny River in southwestern Pennsylvania, where his wife Hannah, daughters Sarah and Effie, and son John, and 3 slaves lived in this area and became quite well known for the hospitality they showed the people who were traveling along the trails along the Youghiogheny. And Crawford became known for, it's near sundown, they would offer the travelers a room for the night, feed them supper, and then feed them breakfast to send them on the way the next day. And this include Native American travelers as well.
So if you stopped history right then, Colonel Crawford should be an American hero for everything that he sounds like he was step for step with George Washington in helping. So then obviously, and the listeners beyond Crawford County, which were named after, right? So where we're coming from is Crawford County in Ohio. And there's a Crawford County in Pennsylvania.
There are several Crawford counties throughout the country.
And so those
Virginia.
are probably named after him as well.
Well, I know for a fact this Crawford County is.
So now let's take the next step in the story and how
he gets back into the military.
Gets back
because he
into
was
the
retired.
military.
Well, he was happily retired. I mean, but unfortunately, the events of history happen at the most inopportune times. Because of Indian raids on the frontier of the colony of Pennsylvania and the Ohio Wilderness in 1781, the Shawnee, which their actual name was the Shawnee had been taking scalps of hundreds of American men, women, and children along the frontier. And it was very, very bloody to the point that Washington, in command of the American troops on the eastern front of the Revolutionary War, had to send an army into the Ohio Wilderness to put down an Indian war that was a result of a group of Christian Indians being massacred by American militia in March of 1782 in the village of Jenayton-Hunton, which is along the Tuscarawas River.
Were those Moravians?
Moravians, yeah. And along the Tuscarawas River, what is now known as Jenayton-Hunton or Ganayton-Hunton, Ohio. These Moravians were harvesting corn in their fields when a group of American militia led by Colonel David Williamson out of Fort Pitt came into the village, saw the Indians harvesting corn. They searched the log cabins of this Indian village and found in a corner of one of the cabins a bloody blue dress, obviously of a white woman, that could be easily identified by one of Williamson's soldiers who they had actually rescued from being captured from the same Shawnee. And John Carpenter was his name, and he identified that dress as being the dress he saw the Shawnees take from the body of a dead American woman that he had witnessed them killing and scalping, and then taking the bloody blue dress off her body prior to the Shawnees seeing Carpenter and capturing him. So they took him away as a prisoner. But he would eventually escape until rescued by Williamson's command. And he would tell these soldiers that the Indians that he saw killed Mrs. Robert Wallace and her 6-month-old daughter and took away her 2 sons as prisoners and then captured him, spoke German. And there was only one group of German-speaking Indians in the entire colonies, and they were the Moravian Christians along the Tuscarawas River in the Ohio frontier. So Williamson's men knew at that moment that they now know who they had to go and attack in order to end the raids on the frontier. There had been rumors since the onset of the Revolutionary War that these Christians who adapted a white man's religion, gave up their Indian culture, started to live, work, eat, dress like Europeans, were actively involved in the war. The British believed that the Christian Indians were spies for the Americans. The American settlers believed that the Christians were spies for the British. And the other native tribes in the eastern woodland cultures could not understand how any self-respecting Native American would give up their Indian culture in order to live like a white man. So none of the people involved in the actual bloodshed of the war believed the Moravians were innocent in this war. They were, and that would eventually be proven. So when Carpenter, after being rescued by Williamson's men, said, well, the Indians that I saw kill this white woman and her baby spoke German, the soldiers knew exactly where they had to go. And this was late February, early March of 1782. Williamson's men had been chasing down these Shawnees for weeks because those are the Indians that actually had committed the attack on the Wallace farm. But one of the little-known stories of this moment is prior to Williamson's army showing up in the village of Jenayton-Hunton on the morning of March 7, 1782, a group of Shawnee had gone through the village of Jenayton-Hunton 2 hours previously. These Shawnees had Williamson's army chasing them, and the Shawnees came into the village of Jenayton-Hunton hungry. They saw the Christian Indians harvesting corn. Now, the Shawnee, or the Shawnee, had the most ruthless reputation of warriors in the Ohio frontier. And because these are Christian Indians, I can imagine them saying, oh my God, they're Shawanazi. Get them whatever they want so they can get out of here. So the Christians gave the Shawnees the corn. In return, the Shawnees gave the Christians a bloody blue dress. And they threw it in one of the log cabins there at Janine Hutton, which within 2 hours would be searched and discovered by Williamson's army. So you put one and one together. It's all circumstantial evidence, Judge, but it was enough to convict these innocent...
Did the glove fit?
Yeah.
That's all.
Innocent men and women and children. There were about 100 Christians at Janine Hutton. Most of them were women and children.
Death by fashion.
Yeah. Yeah.
Death by fashion.
And
Death by fashion. It just...
Yeah.
Oh,
and on March 8th, while these Christians are going to be placed in 2 separate buildings, one would be the Cooper's cabin, which is one of the Christian Indians that lived there was a cooper by trade who had been trained in that craft. And they also put a large group in what would be the building that served as both church and school. And then as these Christians were singing in German the praises of the Psalms, Williamson's men, using a large wooden cooper's mallet, smashed the skulls of every one of those Christians. There were initially 3 survivors, and as history's taught me, there was always survivors of a massacre. And the 3 boys that survived the initial murders were Timothy, Thomas, and Tobias. Once the murders were accomplished, Williamson's men set all the cabins in that village on fire. And once Timothy smelled the smoke and saw the fire of the cabin burning down around him, he dug himself up from underneath the dead bodies that had fallen upon him, ran out the front door, and was shot and killed by one of Williamson's men.
So they were even given Christian names.
Right.
Timothy, Thomas, Tobias.
Once they adopted the Christian faith, they were given names primarily from the Bible of their membership. Thomas and Tobias waited till the cabin was almost burnt to the ground when they ran out the back door to go to the other 3 villages of Schoenbrunn, Goshen, and New Salem, where these Christian Indians were there in their villages harvesting corn to warn them of what Williamson's men had just done at Janine Hutton, because that's where Williamson's men were heading toward those 3 villages. And then once the Thomas and Tobias successfully rescued the other groups, they returned safely back to Upper Sandusky.
Upper Sandusky, yeah.
These Christians lived along the Tuscaroras until fall 1781, when the Wyandot of what would now be Upper Sandusky, Ohio, along the Sandusky River, because of the rumors on the frontier being so prevalent that the Christians were spies for the Americans, the Wyandots ordered that every Christian Indian along the Tuscaroras be brought back to the Wyandot homeland of what is now Upper Sandusky, Ohio, for the winter of 1781 into 1782. That way the Wyandots could keep their eyes on these Christians and their 3 Moravian missionaries.
So how far is it from Ganade Hutton to Upper Sandusky?
It had been about a 4 days walk. And they've just followed the Tuscaroras River into the the Mohican area of Richland County, catch the Sandusky River at its origins there in Leesville, Ohio, outside of Crestline, and follow that all the way over to Wyandotte.
So for our listeners out there, this is Ohio, 1700s. This is before Ohio even became a state.
Right, we're a wilderness.
There's no roads, highways, and things like that. So these kids...
Just Indian trails.
These kids would have, to get to the next village, they would have had to traverse...
These Indian trails, which became the most infuriating 2-lane, wavy, curvy, hilly roads through the worst.
And Route 30 being one of them.
But I live in Salem. I drive in Boston. Our roads are based not even on Indian trails, right? First Nations, whatever, but on actual cow paths.
Yeah,
exactly.
So,
and
the streets of
Boston is the worst place in the world
the
to
streets
drive.
of Boston are terrible.
That's why all the cabs and buses have dents on them.
I was in Boston one time, and I'm in this cab, and we're trying to tell this cab where we want to go. And there's literally, we're in the 3rd lane over. And we're like, no, you had to be in that turn lane. He just blows up. He literally, when the light turns, he cuts in front of 2 left turning turn lanes, just cuts everybody off. And I literally am thinking, is this how people drive here? And he's like, well, yeah. What was I? And the guy, when I go, and so I asked him, he goes, well, what else was I supposed to do? I'm like, well, can't you go around the block?
Oh, no.
I guess for my cab fare. He did the right thing.
Yeah.
So take us back.
It's just how we roll. It's this.
Yeah.
It's this
You adapt or you don't survive.
You have to drive offensively.
We're actually not that bad. Like, I grew up in upstate New York, and in upstate New York, and even in especially in the city, they drive aggressively. Here, it's not so much aggressive as just we drive like there's nobody else on the road at all.
Oh, Columbus.
Yeah.
Like, we're just alone on the road, and so yeah, we can cut across several lanes of traffic. It's no big deal.
Right.
There's just nobody here, right? And you just learn to, look both ways before you do anything at all.
Yeah.
So these kids, these three kids, they've got to get from Grenada.
There's only two.
There's Thomas and Tobias survived the initial massacre of Janain Hutton. The distance from Janain Hutton to Schoenbrunn to Goshen to New Salem is just a matter of a 10-mile radius because they're all built along the Tuscarawas River.
Gotcha.
And so they went to get the natives harvesting the corn in the other villages' fields before they returned to Upper Sandusky, where they'd been taken in October of 1781 by the Wyandot. But like in all eastern woodland cultures during the winter months here in Ohio, which would be no different than New England, it wasn't unusual to have the Native American villages run low on food just for their own members. And now you have about 800 additional mouths to feed in Upper Sandusky because of the Christian Indians being there and their three missionaries, David Zeisberger, Frederick Post, and John Heckewater. Zeisberger, realizing the circumstances surrounding the fact they're running out of food in Upper Sandusky, approaches the Wyandot chiefs and asks, if you allow my people to return to their villages, we left many ears of corn in our fields unharvested prior to you ordering us to come here to your homeland. And the Wyandots agreed to allow about 300 natives to return to their villages to get the corn. The missionaries themselves, being white men, were not allowed to go with them because if the Indians didn't come back with the corn, there'd be 3 dead and scalped Moravian missionaries. So the Moravians did have corn that they did bring back to Upper Sandusky for the duration of 1782. But it also leads to the fact that there would have been enough food in Upper Sandusky for the winter. The Moravians would never had to go to their villages along the Tuscaroras when those Shawnees show up with the bloody blue dress. And Williamson shows up to search the cabins at Janain Hutton where they find the dress. The village would be abandoned. So if there's no massacre of the Christians, the Colonel Crawford story never happens. Because once those Christian Indians are murdered by Williamson's army, the Indians in the frontier now know that these Christian Indians were not spies. They were true to their word. They were neutral. So the Shawnee, the Lenape or Delaware, the Wyandot, some Mingo, some Seneca, as well as British Rangers from Fort Detroit, all form an army to attack the Americans living in the Ohio frontier. And it was a bloody reprisal against what had happened to the Christians. It got very bloody that Washington had to send an army into the frontier, but he needed a commander that he trusted, that he knew had experience against Native Americans. So he wrote a letter to Washington, to Crawford, living at his farm along the Youghiogheny in Pennsylvania. And I've read a copy of this letter that's still in the archives of the Crawford family, descendants. It's a plead. He's begging his friend to come out of retirement. And initially Crawford says, no, I enjoy retirement. But their friendship goes back so many years, and I've had the honor, and I consider it an honor and privilege, of getting to know some descendants of both Washington and Crawford. And both families would tell you that Crawford's closest friend was Washington, and Washington's closest friend was Crawford. So Crawford owed a lot to his friendship, and he agreed to come out of retirement to lead an army from Fort Pitt of 500 men on horseback, leaving Fort Pitt on May 25th, 1782. Their destination was Wyandotte County, and it was a small village that here locally in Crawford County, it's a small village of Wyandotte, which is, I can't think of anything in and around the Boston area that would be this small, but it was a large Indian camp back in 1782. That's where
It's the population of that one Dunkin' Donuts that you get onto the Cape at 8 o'clock.
that's where John Slover, the scout of the army, had told Crawford, that's where the Indians are that we must attack and destroy, who are on the warpath in the Ohio frontier. Colonel Crawford's second in command was Colonel David Williamson, the man responsible for the Moravian Massacre.
Oh, my.
And they traveled from May 25th. They get to June 2nd in and around Crestline, the Leesville area. They continue west. They had left Fort Pitt, and it's been almost a week and a half, and they had not seen any evidence of Indians. And by June 3rd, Crawford's army is little concerned. We're in the heart of Indian territory of frontier Ohio. We've not even seen evidence of a single warrior. The men were scared. And Crawford said, if we don't make contact in the next day or two, we'll turn around and go back to Fort Pitt. Well, on the morning of June 5th, Crawford's army is met in ambush west of Upper Sandusky, where State Highway, where 23 meets with State Highway, I think it's 57, outside of Upper. And there's a large ravine there where about 150 warriors ambush Crawford's army of 520 men. Crawford's men will retreat to a nearby island, which is a high ground surrounded by swamp, and then they'll defend that ground for the duration of June 5th. And it's believed, based upon the eyewitness account of the men who survived this battle, that Crawford's army wins the day. But they're forced to stay there for the night. And during the night of June 5th into June 6th, these primarily Wyandot warriors are now being reinforced by nearly 800 Lenape, Delaware, several hundred Shawnee, plus 250 British light infantry or rangers from Fort Detroit. So when Crawford's army wakes up on the morning of June 6th, they find themselves completely surrounded on the island. It was an indefensible position. So Crawford gave an order.
If you're going to retreating to an island may not be the best tactical decision.
No, way too isolated.
This isn't even like where we're talking. This isn't even like an island out in any water.
No.
This is just like an
surrounded
island
by swamp
in the middle of a field, the middle of a field.
Yeah.
It's almost like a green on a golf course that you're defending against this overwhelming enemy. Crawford gives the general order of a mass retreat. His men go off in every direction, to the northeast, to the southeast, to the east. Crawford's the last to leave the island because he's looking for his son. His son, John, as well as his nephew and son-in-law are all members of his army. John has already escaped, and he would return safely home. So Crawford will leave Battle Island with Dr. Knight, the surgeon of the army, and 10 other soldiers, and they'll go due east from Battle Island, which would be west of Upper Sandusky, Ohio. And by maintaining that due east direction, they end up literally at a location in the small village of Leesville, Ohio, where on June 7th, Crawford will be captured by the Lenape or Delawares. And when I walked that route 40 years ago to see whether the eyewitness account of Dr. John Knight's journal was accurate, I maintained a due easterly direction without being shot from any local farmer by walking along their property from Wyandotte to Crawford County. And it took me within yards of that monument in Lower Leesville Road that says, near this spot on June 7th, 1782, Crawford was captured by the Lenapes. Dr. Knight writes specifically that a mile downriver on the south side of the bank. Now, the origins of the Sandusky River is in Leesville at Lowville Park.
Oh,
So if you go a mile downriver from Allen's Run, that will take you and you're on the south side of the bank. You're standing there looking at the monument there on Lower Leesville Road.
wow.
Now, if you ever go to Low Volk, there's where you stand and you can see where the two rivers converge together as one. It's
And
pretty cool.
the Indian chief of the Lenape that captured Crawford was Crawford's closest Native American friend. His name was Wignu. He was a Lenape chief. He had eaten meals with the Crawford family on many different occasions at their home along the Youghiogheny River. And Dr. Knight had a flintlock pistol, and he was aiming to shoot Wiganoon. And once Crawford recognized his friend Wiganoon, he grabbed Dr. Knight's arm, pulled it down as it discharged, because he said, that's my friend Wiganoon. So Crawford extended his arm to shake the hand of Wiganoon. Wiganoon grabbed him by the arm and pulled him toward himself. And Dr. Knight was also taken prisoner. The other 10 soldiers with them were put to the tomahawk and scalped. And from that point, they'd be taken, Dr. Knight and Crawford would have their faces painted black with charcoal, which is an Eastern Woodlands cultural tradition to indicate death. They were taken back to Wyandotte County, to a small location between what is now the present-day city of Upper Sandusky, Ohio, and Cary, Ohio, off of State Highway 199, where along the Tamachi River Valley, on June 11th, Colonel William Crawford will be tortured and burned at the stake. The Indians knew Williamson was part of Crawford's army. The Native Americans wanted to capture Williamson. The Indians knew Crawford had nothing to do with the murder of the Christians. Once they realized Williamson has escaped with his life, it is decided that Crawford must take his place. So starting about 4 o'clock in the afternoon on June 11th, as witnessed by Dr. John Knight, who would later escape to write an eyewitness account of this story, the Native Americans would strip Crawford naked, hands tied behind his back, and forced to run the gauntlet, which in the Eastern Woodland culture was a traditional torture inflicted upon prisoners of war. But it was carried out by women and children of the tribe, not the warriors. So Crawford was forced to run between 2 rows of Indian women and children who were armed with clubs, hatchets, spears, sticks, anything they could use to inflict great physical pain upon Colonel Crawford. Crawford ran the gauntlet several times. He survived several times, though he was very badly beaten. After successfully surviving the gauntlet, he dropped to his knees. An Indian warrior came out, cut off his earlobes. They forced him to stand. Warriors loaded their flintlock pistols and rifles with gunpowder, not bullets, just powder, put the barrel end of their weapons against his naked body, pulled the trigger, shooting the gunpowder into his naked body. And then Indian children with burning sticks put those burning sticks into the powder wounds to ignite the powder.
Oh,
Jesus Christ!
Most of the wounds.
Yeah, way to make your Salem witch trial stuff look really tame.
Most of the wounds were
All we did was hang people in Salem.
The Puritans had no idea what real torture was all about.
No! Oh my God!
It gets worse.
Okay.
It gets
Oh,
worse.
it gets much worse.
It gets worse.
Oh boy!
Go ahead.
Oh boy! Oh boy! Please, by all means.
Most of the wounds, powder wounds, were in the groinal area because we wanted to make sure it was a slow, painful, agonizing death inflicted upon Crawford for the death of the Christians.
So they basically burned his genitals off.
Yeah. Then he dropped to his knees again. An Indian warrior came out and scalped him. And Dr. Knight writes in his journal, an Indian squaw will gather some hot coals upon a board, walk over to where Crawford was kneeling and put the hot coals on his head where the scalp once was located. And at that point, he passed out. Upon awakening, about 20 minutes later.
Out, like watching. Jesus.
Yeah, so Dr. Knight, they're not doing anything?
Oh, they're going to.
Oh, okay.
The Shawnees had purchased Dr. Knight upon their arrival there along the Tamachi from the Lenapes. And the Shawnees, or the Shawnese, planned to take him down to southern Ohio to do to him what he's now witnessing the Lenapes do to Crawford. So that, as you see, the Shawnees had a wicked
Reminds
sense of
me of the
humor.
time when my brother and I were kids and we got in a bunch of trouble. My dad gets the belt out, and I'm watching my dad whip my brother. I mean, he's holding him up in the air by one arm, and he's just laying him out with that belt. And I'm sitting there watching, going, "I know I'm next."
Yeah.
I mean, I know I'm next. So that's the doctor sitting there watching this, knowing this is what my fate's going to be. So go ahead and tell us what happens next.
And when Crawford awakens about 20 minutes later, his hands are still tied behind his back, but there's a rope attached to a stake that's been driven into the ground about 15 feet from the south bank of the Tamachi Creek. And then Crawford actually has the ability to walk around the stake freely, But because he was so badly beaten with a severe loss of blood, he'd eventually weaken and drop to the ground and die. And this is about probably 6:30 or 7 o'clock that evening on June 11th. And then coals are put over his body and he's burned literally to ash. In the Eastern Woodland cultures, the Native Americans believe that if you're a warrior and you die in sunlight, your spirit after death will find the way to heaven by guidance of the sunlight. If you die at night, you are doomed to roam earth for eternity. Out of respect for Crawford, who Dr. Knight writes in his journal, Crawford at no time during the torture screams or hollers out in pain. In honor of his bravery and courage, they wanted Crawford dead by sundown, before sundown. That way they had grant him the privilege of having his spirit go to heaven. Now, Wiganoon, who had captured Crawford, realized what was in store for his friend if the Indians did not capture Williamson. Wiganoon was not present for the torture or the burning. He could not handle it emotionally. 3 officers of the British Army witnessed the torture and death of Crawford. Now, Crawford, being a former colonel in the Continental Army, is perceived by the British Army as a professional officer. And during the Revolutionary War, when American soldiers captured British officers and vice versa, those officers were granted privilege of protection by their captors to guarantee their safety until officer exchange at the end of the war. Crawford pleaded his case with those British officers from Fort Detroit. Now, the British were here only as invitees by the Native Americans. They were observers. They could not actually participate or intervene on Crawford's behalf. All Dr. Knight writes in his journal is that those 3 British officers got ill to their stomach and started to vomit based upon what they were seeing inflicted upon Crawford. Crawford also turned to Simon Girty, the great loyalist to the British cause, who was himself an American colonial. He pleaded with Girty to speak on his behalf to save his life. Now, Girty and Crawford were acquaintances, and the Girty brothers were very notorious for taking scalps of American men, women, and children during this war. Simon, on the other hand, did more to save lives of prisoners of war than ever take lives. And he became so obnoxious to the Indians that one of the war chieftains said to Simon Girty, unless you're willing to take his place, it'd be best you shut up. And then Crawford died on June 11, 1782, along the banks of the Tamachi.
How old was Crawford?
50 years old.
So he didn't even get to. So how long had he been retired when he got?
He retired in 1779. So he'd been retired 3 years.
3 years.
Now, upon hearing the news of how his friend died at the hand of the Native Americans, the Crawford descendants also have the original letter in their library, but they also allowed me the opportunity to read the letter that he sent Mrs. Crawford. First of all, you can put yourself in Washington's position. He's probably crying while he's writing this letter. It's guilt-ridden, because it's at his prodding that his friend came out of retirement to lead this army that resulted
Because Crawford originally said, no, I'm very happy with retirement.
And Washington, in the letter, he apologized to Mrs. Crawford. I'm sorry I forced your husband to make this decision on my behalf based upon our friendship, but it's already too late.
So did this elicit a response from Washington militarily?
There was still bloodshed in the frontier, but it was not as bloody as it was prior to Crawford's army coming into the Ohio frontier, because the Indians had enacted revenge for the death of the Christians. The Christians stayed in Upper Sandusky to the duration of the war. And, that throughout war, innocent people died. That's a fact of life of war. The Native Americans, the Christian Moravians were at the right place at the wrong time. But if there'd have been enough food in Upper Sandusky, there'd have been no reason for them to go to their villages to harvest the corn. When the Shawnee show up, when Williamson shows up, I mean, that's history. That's one of the fascinating aspects of the study of history. What if? The 2 most important words in the study of history. What if?
So now I ask you when we talked about this, because our podcast is wants to look at the supernatural aspect of this, and you said, because I found it hard to believe that there was nothing, no reports of ghosts or spiritual stuff around where Colonel Crawford was killed, but you said that there were some reports from
in Janine Hutton. I've only been there once to do a presentation with our local reenactment group, the Colonel Crawford Company, who interprets and narrates the story of the Crawford campaign in 1782. And we were there 5 years ago. And a very good member of our group is very sensitive to the supernatural. As I shared with you earlier, the Moravian Indians that were murdered there had their skulls crushed. While she was there with our group during that 2-day event, she had a horrible headache. It was a headache that made her physically ill. And we were within 10 yards of the Cooper's cabin where some of those innocents were murdered. Once she got in her car to return home, once she got out of the village of Janine Hutton, that migraine headache disappeared. And it's because we camped there close to that cabin. And to me, as a student of history and a Revolutionary War reenactor and a Colonel Crawford reenactor, made it more real, visually seeing the locations that have been rebuilt in which these innocents were killed. Now, we do a big event at Schoenbrunn, which is a state park outside of New Philadelphia, Ohio, along the Tuscarawas River, every October. It's an 18th century trade fair. Now, the director of that event is Jack Johnson from Mansfield, Ohio, and he's been in charge of this event for 15 years. Every year we're there in the mid-weekend of October. People are encamped there in what used to be the cabins of the original descendants that had been rebuilt, inhabitants originally built on the foundations of the original cabins. They will hear people speaking German at night. There's one cabin especially where there's a loft and there's a wood ladder going up to that loft. And there are people who stay in that cabin who have talked to Jack Johnson before they left, that they said during the night we're inside around the fire and we see a specter climb down this ladder and walk out the door. And people have been there prior to the event, 2 or 3 days ahead of the event starting on Saturday, within the grounds of Schoenbrunn Village. They will see specters walking the ground, and most of the time they're speaking German.
You can actually hear them talking.
Yes. And you're inside a cabin, you're outside your tent, and you hear in German being spoken. You look outside your tent or cabin, no one.
Now, Kate, listening to your podcast, and as you hear this, these paranormal claims, I know that you yourself have had some paranormal experiences, but you're not a believer. So if you could interject, and this is totally off the whole Colonel Crawford thing, but it goes into the paranormal aspect of, what do you think of hearing that and then your own experiences? And because I still can't believe you're not a believer.
I mean, for one, I think you experience what you expect to experience. And it's easy to, hear noises in the night that travel funny, and it ends up that they're just far enough away that you can't hear them, and that people used to speak German in the area, and so poof, you hear German. Like that. Like we assign meaning to things that may not have meaning. We get a headache because we're stressed out over a reenactment, and we end up assigning meaning to it. Like, that's possible. On the other hand, I've experienced things in my own home, and I've stayed in the Lizzie Borden house. I actually have a video that I cannot explain. Yeah. I'll have to show it to you sometime. Like, there's a video of when a girlfriend of mine and I went down and spent the weekend in the Lizzie Borden house, and we asked the people in the room next over, the woman in the room next to us, to take our photo. And she did, but it ended up coming out as a video, which I didn't even know my phone could do. This is several years ago. And and it's a weird, like it slows down and then speeds up in a strange way. And there's a fourth woman in the room who was not there when we had the picture taken. I am absolutely positive. Right? So, like, I'm not a believer in the sense that, like, I don't necessarily believe that ghosts appear human-ish. Do you know, like, I believe in, like, energies and that kind of thing. Like, I know I've had times where I've just known that something is wrong with a friend and I'll get in touch and it turns out, yeah, something's not good, whatever. But at the same time, I've had things happen that I cannot explain.
So you're more of a believer in like an extrasensory perception versus an actual ghostly figures, the people who have died or coming back, reliving experiences and things like that.
I think we walk through life with an energy to us, and just because we die doesn't mean that energy goes away necessarily.
Right. So basic science, energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It just takes different forms. So, you know, I remember reading this somewhere where he said, well, you know, if I took a car and I disassembled it to all of its different parts, and I brought in the best mechanics and they put it back together, turn the key on, it runs, it drives. But you take a human body and you dismember it and you get the best surgeon in the world, you put it back together, guess what? It doesn't work. Right. Something's missing.
Well, guess what?
That
You end
energy
up in jail.
source.
Yeah.
Well, not in my county. I mean, Jerry's got a few of those bodies in his trunk. We're not going to talk about it today.
Or ever.
Especially after the evil spirits mash liquor situation, which we probably get sued for. But yeah, so energy, you know, the energy of a human being dies, and that energy is still here, possibly.
That's my, like, so, like in my home, there is my house is almost 100 years old in Salem, and so it's Salem, whatever, like weird. And I still have a recurring, what I believed was just a dream, not a nightmare. I have chronic insomnia, and so I believed that I would be lying in bed, my feet face the door, which is bad feng shui, I understand, but my feet face the door, and which means, like, if you come up the stairs to the second floor of my home, you would effectively walk directly into my bedroom. Like, that's how the stairs are oriented. And I had this recurring sort of vision of a woman coming up the stairs, a long dress, sort of hard to see, but that she would come up and she would sort of, what's the word? Like, methodically check each of the bedrooms. Like, she would walk in, come back out to each one, and then disappear. And I thought, what a strange dream. You know, like, it was never malevolent. It was never scary. It was just a thing. And I thought, well, I have a weird dream, whatever. And then about a year ago almost, I was out with my daughter and her girlfriend, and I got talking. Somehow this came up, and my daughter said, yeah, I have a recurring dream that someone is coming in my bedroom at night. And they're just, like, sort of checking on me, and then they go away. And it feels female, but I've never seen her. Because it's complicated. But my daughter sleeps in her closet. It's because of the shape of the closet is exactly the size of a twin mattress, and so that's where she sleeps. It's not a punishment, honest. And so she.
Well, I don't know. Are you sure?
You know, it's odd because Jerry's been in the closet for years. And,
well, you know, fair. Well, that's it. My daughter is gay, so it's fine. But so she has this, this vision of a woman coming in her room, and her girlfriend asked, sort of offhandedly, like, what's her name? And my daughter and I both said at the same time, well, it's Charlotte. And we don't know anybody named Charlotte. There's no reason we would have said such a thing. Like, out of all of the names we could have chosen. So I don't have an explanation for that.
And I've heard you tell that same story at least 3 times on podcasts now, and I still can't believe the truth.
Yeah, I'm boring. I'm so sorry.
Not a bully.
So if this were a criminal case, you know, obviously you wouldn't believe something beyond reasonable doubt. But in civil cases where you just have a preponderance of the evidence, preponderance is more likely than not. So given your experience with this Charlotte situation, is it more likely than not that there's something supernatural going on here, or is it just pure coincidence?
I don't think so, because there's no known, like, I don't have any known history of people dying in my home, and there's no sense of malevolence or angst around this, and I can't come up with, like, it could very well be a shared dream and just complete coincidence that we picked the same name. I wouldn't convict.
Well, so as we wrap up these 2 episodes that we've done, the first thing I'd like to think is that Colonel Crawford's energy has gone on to a better place. If for what that man did for the country and suffered, maybe the Native Americans did him right by allowing his energy to pass on and into a much better place. And I
Christian version of Valhalla.
Exactly. And I think, Kate, we kind of talked about this. You mentioned it about how history repeats itself, and it's because nobody's very smart. And we've heard 2 cases here with the events of the Salem witch trial, and just the history of Colonel Crawford and what the circumstances behind his death, and how we hope that somehow by us getting this history out, and hopefully nobody's going to do
but the moral of the story is the moral of the story is mass hysteria leads to unwarranted persecution of people, and we see that today. Even in I think Twitter has turned into the new Salem witch trials, where someone is falsely accused of something, and then the Twitter mob literally Colonel Crawford you. I mean,
it doesn't even matter if they're falsely or correctly accused.
Right. No,
it just matters that there's an accusation, and Twitter loses its collective mind. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so, obviously those people are not necessarily students of history, or maybe that's just part of our human nature, is that part of human nature is that we as a species love to persecute people.
Yeah, and I think it's important, for that area of where you're at, Kate, to remember the history, even though you have to put up with the
inaccuracies.
Yeah, and it's important for us here to know why Colonel Crawford High School exists, other than just to have really good-looking girls graduate from.
That's why I taught for 35 years too, Kate. The Colonel Crawford School System.
That was the one thing. Yeah.
So, on that note, we thank you, Kate. We know you got to get going, and it was a pleasure having you on for a couple episodes here. So.
Thank you for absolutely destroying my psyche and providing me with nightmares with that story. That was amazing.
Well, we're glad we could help out. So have a great day, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Kate.
Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, a final word. Please visit us on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/From the Shadows Podcast, and on our Instagram page at instagram.com/From the Shadows Podcast. You can visit our webpage at FromTheShadowsPodcast.GoDaddySites.com, or contribute to our Facebook discussion page called After the Shadows, and tweet us on our Twitter feed at twitter.com/podcast_from. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you all. Until next time, never shy away from the darkness or what may be lurking in the shadows. We are out. Ha 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 ha.